What would you do if, on the very morning when your heart was sinking beneath bills, savings, and the silent weight of a fragile new life, one unexpected invitation reminded you that a home is not built by money alone, but by the people who choose to gather around your table and dream of tomorrow with you? It began as one of those mornings that seem gentle from the outside, but feel heavy inside the chest. The light was soft, the air still, the house quiet enough to hear a pencil move across paper. Yet Tu Tien sat at the small wooden table, feeling as though every number in her expense notebook had turned into a whisper of warning. The house they had just bought was real. The walls around her were real. The future she wanted with Jack was real too. But so were the costs, the uncertainty, and the fear that even a warm home could become a burden if life tightened any further. Then the phone rang. Uncle Dung's voice arrived full of joy, inviting her and Jack to come eat at the newly offered house with Mother Ly and Jack's mother. It was such a simple call, almost ordinary, yet it changed the emotional weather of the day. What began as a morning of private worry slowly opened into a gathering of family, food, laughter, and a shared vision of planting a field beside the new house. By the end of the meal, Tu Tien would understand something profound. Sometimes, a future begins not with certainty, but with the moment fear loosens just enough for love, belonging, and hope to sit down beside it. The morning sunlight entered through the wooden window frame in thin golden strips, falling across the small table and the open notebook before Tu Tien. The house was quiet in the way only very early hours can be quiet. There was no noise except the faint scratch of pencil against paper and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She sat alone, one hand holding the page flat, the other moving slowly as she checked each line of spending again. Rice, oil, daily groceries, small repairs, transport, medicine. There was nothing excessive on the page, nothing careless, nothing that could be cut without affecting the shape of their life. And yet, when she looked down at the line marked savings, her eyes always stayed there a little too long. That single word seemed to carry the whole pressure of this new beginning. She had planned to rise early, light the stove, and make a simple breakfast before Jack woke up fully. But she remained seated, as if the numbers themselves had pinned her in place. The house they had just bought was not only a place, it was a promise, a risk, a hope, and a responsibility. Every small expense felt larger now because it echoed into the future. She wanted this home to be warm. She wanted it to be peaceful. She wanted it to become the place where Jack could finally rest and breathe without being chased by hardship. But wanting such things and being able to sustain them were not always the same. A wave of tiredness moved through her, not the tiredness of sleep, but the tiredness of someone who had already begun carrying tomorrow before today had even properly started. Still, she did not let despair settle. Tu Tien had never been the kind of woman who collapsed simply because life grew difficult. She knew how to endure in silence. She knew how to keep moving while worry sat inside her like a stone. Even now, in the pale hush of early morning, something steady remained alive in her, the determination to build a home with whatever strength she had. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the phone rang. The sudden sound broke through the stillness so sharply that she blinked and reached for it at once. When she heard Uncle Dung's voice on the other end, warm and vibrant with genuine happiness, something inside her softened even before she fully understood why. "The new house has already been offered to the ancestors," he said, his words flowing with cheerful energy. "Come over and eat with us. I'm inviting you and Jack. Mother Ly is here, and Jack's mother too. Come and join us." For one heartbeat, Tu Tien said nothing. The invitation entered the room like sunlight after clouds. Just seconds earlier, she had been sitting with numbers, strain, and private fear. Now, suddenly, she was being called into a meal, into family, into a gathering shaped not by debt or accounting but by warmth. Uncle Dung kept talking, enthusiastically describing the food, the welcoming atmosphere, the happiness of the occasion. His voice alone carried enough affection to make her smile. She lifted her head, and the whole house seemed less cold. What moved her most was not simply the meal, it was the feeling behind the invitation. She was not being called because it was convenient. She was being called because she belonged there. That emotional shift mattered more than she could express. Worries do not disappear because someone says, "Come, eat with us," but they do become lighter when the heart realizes it is not carrying everything alone. By the time she ended the call, her expression had changed. She remained seated for one brief moment, still holding the phone, letting the warmth of that simple conversation settle into her. Then she rose and went to tell Jack. He was occupied with work when she found him, his attention lowered over papers and thoughts of his own. But when she told him about the invitation, he looked up immediately. The tiredness around his eyes softened. His whole face seemed to brighten in a quiet, almost boyish way that made her chest ache with tenderness. "Uncle Dung invited us?" he asked, and though his tone was calm, she could hear the relief beneath it. Tu Tien nodded, her own voice carrying a renewed brightness. She told him the new house had been offered to the ancestors, that Mother Lo was there, that his mother was there too, that everyone was waiting. Jack set his work aside more quickly than usual. The mood between them changed at once. There was still the weight of life around them, yes, but in that moment, anticipation entered where worry had been dominating. They got ready together. Tu Tien smoothed her clothes and tied her hair more neatly. Jack moved with unusual lightness, as if being invited into a family meal had pulled him for a moment out of the practical burdens he always carried. On the way there, neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them was gentle. It was the silence of two people walking toward warmth. Tu Tien stole a glance at him once while they were on the road and felt privately thankful that she was not navigating this stage of life alone. New beginnings are frightening because they expose all the ways life can still go wrong. Yet they are also beautiful because sometimes, in the middle of uncertainty, two people continue moving in the same direction anyway. When they arrived at the new house, the aroma of food had already filled the space. It drifted out before they fully entered, rich and comforting, carrying with it the unmistakable promise of care. Inside, Mother Lo turned first, smiling with full-hearted welcome. Jack's mother stood beside her, equally warm, her face lit by the quiet joy older women wear when the people they love come through the door safely. The table had already been set. Nothing was extravagant, and that made it even more moving. Bowls, plates, hot dishes, chopsticks placed with intention, steam rising into the air. It was a simple family table, but to Tu Tien it felt almost ceremonial, not because of wealth, but because of sincerity. Jack sat beside her. That detail alone gave her an odd sense of comfort. The closeness between them felt softer here, less burdened by practical worries, more held by the shared warmth of the gathering. The meal began with light conversation, then with laughter, then with the kind of natural ease that only true welcome can create. Mother Lo told old stories, some humorous, some tender, each one carrying the weight of memory without ever becoming too heavy. Jack's mother nodded, added details, and occasionally corrected something with the affectionate authority only mothers can carry. Uncle Dung spoke with satisfied energy, clearly happy that the house blessing had turned into a real family meal. As the conversation flowed, Tu Tien felt her own heart changing. That morning, she had sat alone, trapped inside expenses and silent fear. Now she was seated at a table where food was shared freely, where voices overlapped gently, where no one asked her to justify her place there. The difference was almost painful in its sweetness. She realized, with a quiet inward start, that she had already stopped thinking about the line-marked savings in her notebook. Not because the expenses had vanished. They had not, but because another truth had become stronger for the moment. Belonging. There are days when a person does not need solutions first. She needs proof that she is not alone in carrying the problem. The meal offered that proof without anyone naming it directly. Every serving spoon lifted, every story told, every smile exchanged across the table felt like a kind of healing. Then the conversation began to shift toward the future. It was Uncle Dung who first suggested it. Since the new house was now ready in spirit and in blessing, why not make use of the land right beside it? Why not create a field there? The idea seemed to brighten the whole room. It was as though everyone at the table had been waiting for hope to become practical. Mother Ly immediately contributed thoughts of her own. Jack's mother nodded with enthusiasm. Tu Tien looked toward Jack, and he looked back at her, and in that brief exchange something passed quietly between them: excitement, relief, and a shared recognition that this was more than conversation. It was the first outline of a future that could actually be touched. A field beside the house meant vegetables, growth, use, rhythm, and a purpose larger than survival. It meant the possibility of abundance, however modest. It meant turning empty land into food, effort into stability, and hope into something rooted in the ground. Ideas began to flow more freely. What should be planted first? How should the rows be arranged? What kind of crops would suit the season? Could the land support enough to feed the house and maybe even bring in some income? Each suggestion felt like a red thread connecting one heart to another. Nobody spoke carelessly. Nobody dismissed the difficulty. But the energy around the table changed from remembrance into construction. By the time the meal was nearing its end, Tu Tien felt almost overwhelmed by gratitude. She looked around the table slowly, at Uncle Dung, at Mother Ly, at Jack's mother, at Jack beside her. A few hours earlier, she had been staring at expenses in silence, feeling as though the future might be too heavy to carry. Now she was surrounded by people discussing a field, a plan, a life. The morning that had begun with anxiety had somehow become a day full of movement, connection, and a fragile but unmistakable vitality. The meal concluded, but the warmth remained. It lingered in the empty bowls, in the softened expressions, in the low voices, still talking about what could be built, planted, and shared. The field beside the house was still only an idea, but already it had done something powerful. It had given shape to hope. And in that shared imagining, even the smallest field became more than land. It became a promise that love, labor, and family could outgrow fear. And perhaps that was the truth Tu Tien carried home with her. A future does not always begin when fear disappears. Sometimes it begins at the exact moment fear is interrupted by an invitation, a meal, a family gathering, and a shared plan for the ground beside the house. In that simple room, around that ordinary table, she understood that a home is not sustained by money alone. It is sustained by the people who gather when your heart is quiet with worry and remind you, by their presence, that tomorrow can still be planted.